This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Jake Schwartz, who is with Green Corps, that's CORPS, the country's most respected field school for environmental organizing. Jake is currently working as a Southern California organizer for the nonprofit Don't Cage Our Oceans to get the word out about soon to be introduced legislation called the Seafood Act for planned large scale fisheries off the Ventura Coast. When I first heard about fisheries, I thought, oh, good, more fish. I love fish because we've all heard about how the oceans have been overfished and there aren't enough fish, but not so fast. There are many aspects of fisheries that are not good for the ocean and not as productive of protein as we might think. I attended a meeting of the Ventura Climate Coalition where I heard Jake's presentation, and with his permission, I'm going to play it on the air right now and then ask him some follow-up questions and to help define some terms I didn't quite get, so perhaps our listener didn't either. This is quite a lot to take in all at once.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all for having me tonight. I really appreciate it. So as the email explained, my name is Jake Schwartz. I am the Southern California organizer for this national nonprofit called Don't Cage Our Oceans. So Don't Cage Our Oceans is a nonprofit, a C3, representing a broad coalition of different environmental groups around the country that are standing firm against industrial scale fish farms and these new projects that are developing largely right here in Southern California. So as the Southern California point person, I'm rallying groups, grassroots groups like yours, other nonprofits, fishermen, seafood restaurants, all these groups in opposition to these big developments that are planned for the shores of Ventura. So first, let's talk a little bit more about what these pens look like, kind of what they physically are, and then we'll talk about the political context and the work we're doing right here in Ventura County. So these are giant, minimum 45-foot in diameter pens that are planned for federal waters right off the coast of Ventura County. So starting right at 3 miles out. They raise tens of thousands of fish in each pen, cramping them, really, really densely populated. And then they pump antibiotics and other chemicals into the vents to kill the sea lice that frequently spread amongst the farmed fish population, but then also can spread to the wild stock as well. But then the pesticides, things that used to kill the sea lice, antibiotics, they get into the water as well. They can cause toxic algae blooms and dead zones, which are bad for the wild fish stocks as well, bad for the rest of the marine ecosystem, bad for the coral, and then also indirectly bad for the marine mammals that can get hurt, through their food chain, and then also through swimming into these nets. And there's been documented cases of humpback whales migrating up the coast that get caught in these nets and die. So definitely concerning to the marine ecosystem itself for multiple reasons, but it's also very much a climate issue. So we're talking about many or multiple of these massive developments, minimum 3 miles out at sea. So just think of what that takes to construct something that large, and then think of what it takes to feed these fish every single day. Huge barges going up and down the coast, feeding all these developments 3 miles out and back every single day. And then what are they actually fed? They're fed pellets, usually comprised of soy. So then we're transporting soy all the way from the Midwest over here to California, and they're feeding that to the fish. And then also smaller fish, rockfish, which is ironic in its own right because we're feeding fish other fish. So it doesn't actually help, or at least not as much as the companies say, with what they call the protein problem. The fact there's not enough fish in the sea. That's what companies will most frequently say, oh, we need fish farms, we're running out of fish. Well, we are eventually running out of fish, but raising fish that we then feed other fish does not actually address the problem. And in the process of making the problem, makes the problem worse. As we're, there's a massive amount of carbon emissions related with the feeding of the fish, the transport of the fish, then exporting those fish, exporting them. Sometimes they're exported to Mexico for packaging and then imported back to America to be sold to restaurants. So it's really a ridiculous process and heavily carbon intensive. So that's just a quick summary on kind of the science of it. And I'm happy to answer any questions after this is done. Some brief political context. So in May of 2020, Trump signed Executive Order 1391, which allowed for these developments called called aquaculture. So aquaculture developments in federal waters. Since then, President Biden has not rescinded the executive order. So it's still technically able to be permitted. And there are several bills in Congress that are being put forth to streamline the permitting process. So there's one bill that we're paying a particular close attention to. It's called the Seafood Act. And among other things, it would streamline this permitting process and kind of solidify into law the Trump executive order, which is technically on shaky legal grounds. So the executive order by itself is really, we think, not enough for these giant developments to be built. What it did is it directed NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to study the spots where they thought they should be. And they think they identified 19 spots around the country. 10 out of those 19 were in Southern California, and 8 out of those 10 were right in the Santa Barbara Channel. Closest city to them is Ventura. So literally right in our backyards. So the Seafood Act would solidify those and then actually mandate that some of these developments are built. Up to 4 of them would be built. So kind of force the government's hand and kind of force them to give permits to at least, the language is 1 to 4. And then after the fact, this bill mandates a study of these developments. Our stance on that is they've been studied. They've been studied in multiple countries over the years. We know their effect on water quality. We know their effect on fish stocks, on marine mammals, and then also on fishermen who can get, cut out of the market by these big corporations that are just factory farming their fish instead of sustainably line catching them. So it's really bad for local economic, coastal communities like we see, Oxnard, Ventura, all throughout Ventura County. So those are all the reasons why it's bad. The Seafood Act would solidify these. Last Congress, in the 117th, it was introduced by Congressman Alan Lowenthal, who is no longer in Congress. But the Ventura County member, Julia Brownlee, was one of the original primary co-sponsors on the bill last Congress. And we believe she's going to reintroduce it this Congress. There are only a couple co-sponsors last Congress, only 4. And we believe she's going to be the one to put it forth in the 118th. And worse than that, we think she's going to do it any week now, pretty imminently. So I'm working here in Ventura County to do all we can to rally local environmental groups like yours against this bill, again called the Seafood Act, that would regulate this permitting process and mandate that several are built. And as 8 out of the 19 of the entire country are here in the Santa Barbara Channel, it's very, very likely that at least several starting off would be built right here in our backyards. I mean, we are the area in the entire country most hurt by these developments. And ironically, it's Julia Brownlee's district, which doesn't include Ventura City itself, but most of the county, that is the single closest congressional district to where these developments would be. And she's the one, we believe, set to reintroduce this bill imminently. So that brings us to kind of what we're doing right now. So we're working on a lot of different tactics across the country, a lot of media, a lot of grassroots stuff. We're collecting petitions, trying to get to 1,000s. We have a growing coalition, just a general coalition nationwide. So at some point I can kind of share more information about that and send a link of who's in it right now. We have 3 dozen environmental groups. We're currently in our coalition. But the thing we're working on right now, like this week, is a letter to Congresswoman Brownlee's office saying groups in your district, from fishermen to seafood restaurants to local politicians to environmental groups like VCC, we do not want this in our backyard. And we list the reasons why it's bad for kind of every aspect of the marine ecosystem, and then just the climate itself. I mean, Brownlee calls herself a climate champion, and she has done some really positive stuff in the past, but these developments will be really, really harmful for her community, the people who live in her community, and the fight against climate change at large. So we're really focused on rallying groups against it, and we would love VCC's sign on to this letter. So I think Kathleen sent that in the email. I'm happy to kind of circulate it again and answer any questions on that letter. For the next kind of week or two, we're looking to get at least 12 sign-ons. So we're talking to probably 12 nonprofits like yours, in addition to fishermen, restaurants, and some local leaders. So hopefully, enough of them say yes. We can get at the very least 10 sign-ons and send that to her office, ideally within the next 10 or so days before she reintroduces this bill. So she's incentivized not to. We also have our legislative director in DC. We have, we're writing op-eds. We wrote an op-ed in the San Diego Union Tribune the other day. So there's a lot of things we're doing to try to pressure her. But in my opinion, nothing matters more than the grassroots work going on in her district, in the California 26th. So I know many of you, if you live in the city of Ventura, might not live in her district, but as your group is, a powerhouse of the environmental climate change movement in Ventura County, it's definitely, a very strong voice that Brownlee definitely listens to when it comes to issues like this. So we would absolutely love your sign on, and I would love to take any questions about either the science of it, the politics of it, or anything else that you guys might have.
Well, I was wondering, why does it most hurt Ventura? I know you mentioned local fishermen who line catch, But what other ways besides bringing in the soy food, and why is it going to hurt us so much? And doesn't Julie Brownlee know about this?
Right. So I think the biggest direct impact is that economic impact. So
Oh,
fishermen not only are undercut at the market, and that's real, but it's kind of not direct. They might not be able to sell the fish at the same price. They're much more directly hurt every single day when they fish. Right. I mean, they fish in these areas where these developments would be, or at least some of them do. And I've talked to fishermen who are like, that's where I fish. I fish at the 3 mile mark. That means they're going to have to go around these areas just to get to where they fish. Okay, minor inconvenience maybe, but then as I talked to in the very beginning, the sea lice that often salmon and tuna have, and also the antibiotics that they're pumping in can cause those toxic algae blooms that contaminate whole swaths of the ocean. And that is exactly where the fishermen of Ventura County fish. So I mean, that's the entire region where they fish could be hurt. And then once they fish, let's say they successfully get as many fish in the day, then they come back home, try to sell their fish, and they can still be undercut by these massive corporations. So really directly hurts the fishermen, but including recreational, people who own boats and people who like swimming and people who enjoy the ocean. We don't know how bad these toxic algae blooms could become. In addition to all the climate effects, of course.
Elspeth.
Does the legislation that exists and the efforts to address it separate finfish farming from bivalve and algal?
Absolutely. Sorry, I should have mentioned that up top. So Don't Cage Our Oceans is strictly against industrial scale offshore finfish aquaculture.
Finfish only.
So we're not against the shellfish farmers and the mussel farmers and the kelp farmers. There's a lot of ways to do that sustainably. And there's a lot of ways that can even kelp farming can help climate and help carbon storage. But it's the finfish aquaculture that becomes, it's just you can't do it sustainably. It's just really not possible because you have to have so many of them to make up the scale, and they're so big, and you need these antibiotics to kill the sea lice. There's no way to do it on a small scale, sustainable way. And so that's what's directly harming our waters and our climate. So
yes, throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Of course. And it is really nuanced because this bill, the Seafood Act, the areas that it highlights could be used for other things too. But there's an amendment in it, language that specifically says there has to be 1 to 4 finfish farms. So specifically that language that we're asking her to take out. I mean, preferably she'd kind of start from scratch, and there's many ways to do this right that are not the Seafood Act. But at the very least, we want this language that mandates the finfish farms to be removed from the language.
Well, I just wanted to ask one other question. I mean, is there an alternative? Am I hearing this correctly? That if it were done small scale, it's the large scale of it for raising finfish. I mean, it sounds like a really, when you first hear, good idea to farm fish and farm them in the ocean, but it's right. Too big a scale. So it's like raising beef on these factory farms.
Exactly. That's exactly what it's like. So unfortunately, this bill is not a small scale bill, and it would allow these kind of large scale developments. There definitely are other pieces of legislation that we're closely following that we really, really like. So there's a bill that's being reintroduced. So it's being introduced for the first time in hopefully next month or two by Senator Booker from New Jersey that would outlaw large scale finfish farming, but instead would allocate money to studies on sustainability and then allocate grants specifically to working waterfronts, he calls it, and kind of help fishermen get a leg up against these big corporations. So there's definitely legislation we're strongly supporting. We're not just saying no, no, no.
I thought that we had some protection zones around our islands out here. Is there anything that interferes with that?
Great question. Yes, there are MPAs, marine protected areas, in both state and federal water. So I know they are around the islands, and I know these spots are very close to those zones. So they're not allowed to be in the zone. So they're not, whatever the zone is around the islands, they're not in them. But I do know at least one of them is like touching it, bordering it. And again, it causes a lot of pollution. So, it's not going to stay in the tiny little zone where it's allocated. So it's very possible that it could drift into these MPAs. A lot of work we're doing up here in Ventura County. I mean, it's quite literally the most important area in the entire country right now for this issue. And I'm up in Ventura every weekend working on these issues, talking to folks. So I'd love to keep this conversation ongoing. Maybe meet some of you guys in person. We're planning a couple events in the next couple months. So we'll definitely keep you guys updated, and we'd love to continue this work.
So we'll have a station break right now before talking to Jake, and that is KPPQ LP Ventura 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Jake Schwartz, who gave the preceding pre-recorded presentation about proposed legislation to develop large-scale finfish farming off the Ventura Coast. We're so happy to have you here today, Jake.
Thank you so much for having me, Kathleen. It's a pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. Some say God is in the details, and some say it's the devil in the details. But whichever is true, I decided after hearing your presentation that we all need to know more about the details of and the impact aquaculture is going to have on the oceans and on fish. I think in particular, our leaders need to review some of the details of factory fish farming before voting on it. Now, I think a good place to start is by explaining where finfish like salmon and tuna are on the fish food chain. These fish are targeted candidates for this large-scale farming. So tell us where the salmon and the tuna are.
Right. So when it comes to finfish, salmon and tuna are pretty much top of the food chain. So they are carnivorous fish. They mostly eat, other forms of fish. And so anytime we feed fish to other fish, it's a net loss of protein. So while these farmed fish might be able to produce more, sushi grade yellowtail tuna, it actually worsens the seafood problem or the fact that we are running out of fish in the sea. So fish farms are not the solution to this problem.
Uh-huh. So are all finfish predators or carnivores, as you said?
Nope, not all finfish, but the two main fish that are raised in farms, tuna and salmon, are.
Uh-huh. And what will they eat in these farms? Now, presumably, since they're predators, they will eat other fish. What kind?
Right, exactly. So that's the problem. They eat pellets, which are made of a combination of soy and fish meal. And that fish meal is made up of smaller fish like mackerel, herring, sardines, anchovies, and actually finfish guts. But again, the problem is because they're eating smaller fish, there's actually a net loss of fish just to produce more and more of these quote unquote nicer fish, such as yellowtail and salmon.
So I kind of imagine when I heard they eat smaller fish that they were going to eat live, whole, smaller fish like they do in the wild, but not the case.
Nope. Unfortunately, these fish farms are nothing like the wild. Instead of eating fish like they normally would, they eat these small pressure condensed pellets.
Uh-huh. So how does fish meal and the soy meal create problems in the pens? Now, and is there any other food for these fish?
So there are many, many problems that come from the fish meal and the soy pellets. So I think the biggest problem is the pollution. So as we can talk about later, they also pump antibiotics into these pens. And so the antibiotics mix in with the excess food because they, feed them too much to get them fat, and then also the fish waste. And because they're in these small pens, it all condenses together and pollutes the whole area. And it can create toxic algae blooms and even dead zones where there's no oxygen in the water to support the rest of the marine ecosystem in that area.
So I was imagining that these pens were like nets. Well, are they like totally enclosed? I mean, I thought the ocean water flowed in and out.
Right. So some ocean water, for most of them, there are varying versions, does flow in and out. But what that means is it can take the pollutants out of the cage, the ones that aren't treated, and circulate them to the region around those cages.
Oh, okay. So then the wild fish are also intaking all the antibiotics, the soy,
Exactly.
whatever the fish guts. Yeah.
That's exactly the problem. Is all that those pollutants mixed together and cause real damage to the areas around those pens where our wild fish thrive.
Do they have any idea of how far from the pens, the waste material and the meal goes? I mean, or is it just indiscriminate? It travels on and on.
Right. I don't have an exact answer, so I don't give you an exact answer, but it definitely travels beyond just the pens themselves.
Okay. So, I mean, could they eat something better, like algae or plankton, or don't these fish eat plankton?
Right. So algae is a small part of wild salmon's diet, but the pellets that they're feeding them are purposely to fatten these fish up, right? To make them as fat as possible to turn them into sushi. And so most of the pellets are at least 45%
ranges from 18 to 50, but the average is 45% fat or 45% protein in the pellets.
Okay, so algae is actually okay for wild fish. I mean, it's a part of their diet, but not.
I believe it's a small part of their diet, but because they're mostly carnivorous fish, you have to feed them other fish.
Oh, okay. Well, let's get to the carbon footprint of transporting fish meal and soy meal. How big is that?
Right. So if you can imagine, soy is grown in the Midwest of America, and that's
Right.
factory grown, and then that's shipped all the way to the California coast, and then it would be put on barges and brought out to these pens, which are in federal waters, which means it starts at least 3 miles out. So these barges going out almost every day, at least 3 miles to all the different sites, feeding them. You can just imagine all the carbon that takes all the way from the farms of Iowa to federal waters 3, 6, 8, 9 miles off the coast of California.
Right. And these are the kind of things you don't think about right away. So it really is kind of a zero-sum game to feed fish, to grow other fish. And we don't actually gain any fish this way. The number doesn't go up at all.
Exactly. And that's the crux of the problem. So we call that the protein problem, where it's a net loss of not only energy. I mean, every time you feed animals to other animals, it's a net loss of energy, but it's also a net loss of protein when you feed fish to other fish. So while these fish farms might be able to produce more, fancy fish, it actually worsens the root problem.
So is it healthy to grow a lot of fish in crowded pens? I mean, is that why they need to give them antibiotics?
Well, great question. It's actually very, very unhealthy. So sustainable aquaculture, which we support, is when it encompasses values and supports coastal economies and local infrastructure. So there are ways to do it sustainably with shellfish and kelp and recirculating farms on land. But these giant offshore fish farms out at sea are very, very unhealthy. So in addition to, we talked about the excess feed and the excess waste, there are also these antibiotics that these companies pump in to kill the sea lice that are very prevalent on these fish.
Wow.
So sea lice can eat into the flesh of the fish, make them totally unmarketable. So, obviously companies are there to protect their profit margins. So they pump massive amounts of these antibiotics, which for the most part kill the sea lice, but then also can contribute to this pollution and the toxic algae zones that can follow.
Right. And we're actually intaking, if we eat that sushi made from these wonderful tunas and salmon, we're taking that antibiotic in as well.
Indirectly, yes, that's correct.
Oh, okay. So I've heard that people who can afford to buy these fish are affluent enough that they don't really have a protein intake issue. I mean, it's not like we're growing fish for third world country people who, don't have enough to eat. It's really only the wealthier people who can afford them.
Again, that's exactly the problem. So some of these corporations might pretend that this is all about feeding the world, but it simply is not, as we can see right here in these planned fish farms in California. So there's one currently under permitting review down in San Diego, planned by a company called Pacific 6, that would be all yellowtail tuna. And so they talk a big game about helping feed the world, but you're right when you say it's about getting nice fish to more affluent customers instead of more sustainably caught fish to more people.
Also, the omega problem that this came up. I mean, I thought, oh, hey, good idea, because I really like salmon and tuna. I like sushi, and they have the omegas in them, which are really good for our health. Is this why corporations can charge this and other reasons high prices and make huge profits?
I'm not an economist, but yeah, I mean, they again are purposely creating nicer fish that they can charge often at a higher price, which in the process, hurts our local fishermen, hurts what we're doing now to get more fish for more people, and can cut these local fishermen out of the market.
I actually saw a documentary about they were raising tuna in the Black Sea, and these are beautiful, big, fat, tuna, $50,000 a piece. Was being charged. So the purpose of mega fisheries is really economics and profit. Now, how does aquaculture affect our local fishermen who mainly sell their sustainably caught fish to the community?
Right. Great question, Kathleen. So it can put a lot of fishermen at real risk of going out of business. It means there are fishermen that wake up at 4 a.m. every morning and they take their 18 or 20 feet long boats out and they fish all day. And they've been doing that for generations. And all of a sudden, that's really at a risk. I mean, fishing is a way of life here in Ventura. It's part of the fabric of the town, and we have to protect them. A lot of fishermen have been doing this literally for generations. But the rules of the game are changing, and we have to make sure these fishermen have a fair shot at continuing to fish in the future, right? If these fishermen's children want to keep fishing like their parents did and their grandparents did and their great-grandparents did, they can't be competing at these massive corporations that are factory farming their fish in the exact same places that these fishermen are fishing. Both physically harder to fish because the sites are there and then the pollutants are there. And then when they successfully finally fish to the extent they did before, they'd have to come back to Ventura, come back to market, and they compete against these corporations when they're selling their fish.
So does California have rules and regulation about sustainably farmed fish? I mean, and will the federal legislation override the California laws and regulations?
No, not at all. So California is a leader on this issue. Fish farming is totally banned in California state waters. So the sites that we're talking about, which are called aquaculture opportunity areas or AOAs, are only in federal waters. So starting 3 miles out, these sites are planned, which from a carbon perspective is actually worse because then these giant barges have to go, again, 3+ miles out every single day to feed these fish.
Now, does the actual growing of the fish farming, does it create more employment, or is it pretty industrialized so that it really doesn't take that much manpower?
Right. It's a very industrialized and high-tech industry. Once they're built, there's not much employment at all. I mean, there's massive corporations operating these giant barges, doing this on the largest scale possible at the same time, putting these fishermen out of business. So really it's a net job loss if you consider how many fishermen and the related industries you're actually putting out of business.
Are there any, we don't have much time left, but what are a few of the modifications that you suggest for Congresswoman Brownlee, who is proposing this legislation?
Right. So it hasn't been introduced yet, but there's this bill called the Seafood Act that was introduced last Congress and will probably reintroduced again very shortly. And there's many problems with the bill, but the whole concept of it is that it's based off of Trump's executive order, which he signed in May 2020, 921, promoting American seafood competitiveness and economic growth, which would allow these sites to happen in federal waters, and created these AOAs, or aquaculture opportunity areas, for these sites to take place. So one of the problems with the Seafood Act is that it would kind of legalize and formalize these areas. The other problem is that it would actually require sites to be built on those sites.
We're about out of time. How can people find out more? What website should they go to?
Absolutely. We would love people to learn more. And if they're free to help out, you can check out our campaign at don'tcageouroceans.org. And you can shoot me an email at jake@greencore.org if you're looking to get involved.
Okay, thank you so much, Jake Schwartz, for coming in to answer more questions about large-scale farming of finfish and its unsustainability.
Thank you so much for having me, Kathleen. It's a pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good.